Positive Solutions with Dr. Gordon is a podcast which focuses on contemporary social and educational issues from an educational leadership and behavioral research perspective. We will delve into those issues that are important to you as we listen to understand the needs of others and positively respond to address those needs, concerns, and/or fears. Professionals in their respective fields of expertise, in addition to friends of the podcast, will share their unique perspectives of positive solutions to what matters to you most. Join us every Sunday afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central Time, as we share positive solutions to those issues that are important to you.
A very pleasant good afternoon. Thank you for joining Positive Solutions with Dr. Gordon. Today's guest is a pastor of the St. Croix Reformed Church, Pastor Peter TeWinkle, who will share with us his thoughts on restorative justice, what it is not, the purpose, the characteristics, and the theory of restorative justice. But before we get to meet Pastor Peter TeWinkle, and before we start our conversation about restorative justice, let's pause for just a second as we get ready for our fun trivia segment of the podcast.
Do you know a whole lot of information that you would like to utilize in a fun and useful way? Or perhaps you like learning new fun facts, which can be used as conversation starters at a meal with a friend or while standing in a long line. The Ultimate Trivial Pursuit Question and Answer book contains fun facts of sports and leisure, science and nature, arts and literature, history, entertainment, and geography. Test your skills with others every week as we begin our episodes with fun trivia. You'll be given 6 questions at the beginning of the podcast, and you will have the opportunity to post your correct answers to all 6 questions to drgordonpodcast1@gmail.com. The first person to post all 6 correct answers will have their names announced as the winner on the following episode. The person with the most wins after 50 episodes will win a gift certificate from our podcast's gift basket of tangible goodies. Who knows? Maybe you can win dinner for 2 at a restaurant in your area, or enjoy a full body massage from a licensed health and fitness spa. Don't be bashful. Join the fun every Sunday afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central Time on this podcast, Positive Solutions with Dr. Gordon.
Before we get started with our fun trivia segment of the podcast, let me just pause also to say thank you. Thank you very much for joining Positive Solutions with Dr. Gordon this past month of October when we had our hard rollout. It was a great success, and we had 100 downloads as of October 27th. So that is awesome. And I do thank you for joining in, if not just out of curiosity, but also for participating, for those of my guests who joined me, and also for those of you who have been sharing words of encouragement with me. And so with the fun trivia segment of the podcast, we know that there are some people that have lots of information and they want to know what they can do with it. Well, here's an opportunity for you to put your knowledge to the test. And because it is an open book test where you have an opportunity to Google the answers, all of the answers do need to be correct. So for those of you who have been submitting partial answers based upon what you do know that it's okay. You can check out Google, find the answers, but you have to submit all of the 6 answers, and they have to be correct to those questions that you receive weekly. And after 50 episodes, then there's a gift of tangible sorts that you will receive. So by now you should have already received your pen and paper and are ready to begin with our questions for today. So question number 1. This segment covers geography. All right. Question number 1. What city is the capital of New York State? What city is the capital of New York State? And as always, I'll say the questions twice. Listen carefully and write down the answer to the question. Question number 2. What is each household in Bermuda only permitted one of to protect the environment? What is each household in Bermuda only permitted one of to protect the environment? Question number 3. Which ocean's name means peaceful? Which ocean's name means peaceful? Question number 4. What tunnel's 23.55 mile undersea section is the longest undersea passenger tunnel in the world? I'll say it again. That was a long question. Again, question number 4. What tunnel's 23.55 mile undersea section is the longest undersea passenger tunnel in the world? Question number 5. What is Africa's second highest mountain? What is Africa's second highest mountain? Question number 6. What sea can you dip your toes in from the western beaches of Lebanon? What sea can you dip your toes in from the western beaches of Lebanon? Go ahead and select the correct answers, write them down, and submit them to drgordonpodcast1@gmail.com. And let's see how you do. Again, all of the answers do need to be correct. Here's a hint. Google it.
You're listening to the podcast Positive Solutions with Dr. Gordon, which is uploaded weekly on Sunday afternoons at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central on your favorite podcast directory.
A very pleasant good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to Positive Solutions with Dr. Gordon. We have an honored guest with us today, Pastor Peter TeWinkle. I almost said Dr. Peter TeWinkle. You never know.
Not yet.
We're planting the seeds.
Right.
You never know what might happen. And so Pastor Peter TeWinkle is commonly referred to as Pastor Peter here on St. Croix. He's a pastor of the Reformed Church. And I would like for us to get to know Pastor Peter as he shares with us about restorative justice. So Pastor Peter, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Gordon. It's a pleasure to be here and talking with you, and especially about restorative justice, because it's a passion of mine. It's something I'm really interested in, and I think is such holds so much potential for a positive solution for St. Croix everywhere, really. But looking forward to doing what I can to have that conversation here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for being here. And so I would like for my guests to get to know who Pastor Peter is. And so before we get into talking about restorative justice, can you give us a little bit about your background and what led you to becoming a pastor and getting on this trail of restorative justice and sharing this message with a lot of individuals?
Yeah, I'm a Midwest boy. I grew up in the state of Wisconsin. I was born in Madison, but my home really is Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Okay. So it's a funny name city, but it's a mid-sized city surrounded by farmland. So those dynamics, that number of people and that rural setting, there are parts of St. Croix rural feel and things like that. So it's vastly different. In terms of the people and in terms of the weather and things like that. But it doesn't feel totally foreign to me, having moved here a few years ago. So, but, I grew up, Bill is my dad, Jill is my mom. I've got a younger sister named Katie. So growing up there in the Midwest was the beginning of my life and this journey. I think one of the things I forget about often, the more I just talk about restorative justice specifically, is how much that faith component was a part of leading me in this direction.
Right.
As the Reformed Church, we've talked before, the Reformed Church, if there's anything kind of distinctive about it, it is kind of this heavy emphasis on education and a heavy emphasis on how central scripture is, as opposed to, tradition or experience. So I think I just kind of take that for granted, that thinking a lot and thinking deeply about scripture is central to what Christianity was for me growing up. So we talked about it a lot. We studied a lot. We thought systematically about it all the time. And so I think just taking seriously that, and once you get past the surface of sort of a child's education, things start leaping off the page to you that, to me, things left off the page to me that I didn't expect to be there. And one of those things was the constant call to do justice in the world,
Right.
particularly in the prophets. So that was a big thing for me. As I kind of came of age and became responsible for myself and became an adult, I had to really, if I was going to take my faith seriously, I had to figure out how to take justice seriously as well. That's a big part.
What comes to my mind is that verse that says to love justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. That's a paraphrase of that verse, and that's key. That's important.
It was close enough. And I think what stuck out to me at one point about that particular verse is when people say it, and sometimes when you see it quoted either on a wall design or on a mug or magnet on a refrigerator, what's implied is that the with God part at the end is only attached to the walk humbly. So you do justice, you love kindness, and then you walk humbly with God. But I think there's good reason to think that you could read the verse as do justice with God, love kindness with God, and walk humbly with God, as if all three are things that God does with whom we're supposed to do those things as well. That's the way I've kind of
right.
chosen to read
He's the
it.
center of it all, and if we accept that, then everything that we say, everything that we do would reflect that, and it would be evidenced in our tone, our rhetoric. Not rhetoric, it won't be rhetoric, it'll be actually the message that we're conveying, as opposed to the rhetoric that we tend to hear as we listen to the news and see what's happening in the world. There's a lot of divisiveness that's going on right now, and a number of folks are just exhausted, they're tired. And so how do we utilize our talents, our gifts, our professions to bring about that healing in the world today? And so we've talked about restorative justice. And so what led you into restorative justice? Did you go to school or college, or as you were growing up, did you encounter injustice? Did you witness that and felt, what, this is not what it should be like? What happened?
My parents both were in politics. My dad was a state senator for a while.
Okay.
I think it was always sort of in the background, and I think it's something I sort of take for granted again as normal for people, to have politics as sort of part of your life. But I realize more and more that's just not the case.
Right.
And I also think something I take for granted, my sister and I were talking about this past summer, that my parents weren't overtly anti-racist in any way that we would understand by today's terms. But I know they supported Jesse Jackson in the election. We listened to gospel music as much as we did to contemporary Christian music.
Right.
So I think the message I take for granted is that, we can learn from different cultures. We can respect leaders and can support leaders of a different race than our own. So I don't think it was anything real intentional that they did. It was just part of, like politics, just part of the background of my life.
Right.
So when I got to college and was going through the education program and really began to learn about how unequal the education system was, I think that was my first experience with what injustice meant. That you've got kids who were born and by no fault of their own, they hadn't even been given the chance to make choices yet, are just resigned to this unequal, under-resourced school that is going to really limit their opportunities. And that just seemed the height of unfairness. So I have this faith background and family background with justice and politics, and I start to encounter these inequalities in the education system and learn that they're in other systems too. And I think slowly that call to ministry sort of comes out of that. And I feel the need to figure out, how do we convey to people who say they follow Jesus that justice is essential to what he's calling us to do. And he's asking us to sort of shape the world in that way. And so here I am.
No,
as a pastor on St. Croix,
yeah,
trying to teach about restorative justice.
Yeah, no, thank you for what you're doing. Since the pandemic, we've been viewing the services at the Reformed Church that you have live streaming. And even prior to the pandemic, for Jazz Vespers, you would have a few talks that you would give, that you would share with the audience prior to the performance. And it dealt with restorative justice in a way where you talked about coming together as a community and celebrating those similarities and also the differences, but pulling our resources together to heal and to just move forward. And that is so important. That is key, especially today in which we're living. Some folks, they hear the word justice, but they have different operational definitions for the word justice. So what is restorative justice for someone who might not know what it is?
Restorative justice is a way to make things right. And just the way you share it there, I think kind of calls to mind some of my story as a pastor, as a person of faith, is that for all of what I just said, I still grew up in a church setting that kind of had this punitive understanding of God, that kind of how we know God is as someone who is, punishing sin, or would punish sin if not for punishing Jesus. That's kind of a really simplistic way to say it, but I think that's the way a lot of people hear the story. And so rejecting kind of a punitive understanding, I went to sort of a way on the other end of the spectrum, a distributive understanding, like God will give us what we need or what we deserve. And so you kind of see those ways of making things right advocated for in the world. When we think of crime and punishment, people think we'll make things right by meting out the right punishment. Through punitive justice, we will make things right in the world. And those who reject that are way on the other end of the spectrum, and they say, you know what, we're going to make things right by giving people things that they deserve. And by doing that, things will be better. And I think what both of those things have in common, as different as they might appear, is that they're really sort of top down. Right. And in our setting, the government would decide what the punishment is, or what people deserve to have, and then give those things out. So restorative justice is very different, because it's not top down. It's not about controlling people through punishment or through giving things. It's really about engaging people in the process of making things right, because what we want to do at the end of the day is restore the social fabric. We want to restore individuals to the community. We want to restore trust. And so really that's what's underneath restorative justice. We want to engage everybody in making things right by restoring what is good in the world. So that's what that would be the big difference for me between those three.
Right, and thank you for that the clarity in that, because some folks have that operational definition that justice means giving the most severe consequence and then throwing away the key, and that's it. And then, of course, the extreme end of that spectrum is, like you said, just providing whatever gifts, or I don't know what you want to call it, but giving things to individuals to try and appease them, hoping that their behavior would then change, whereas the issue was not dealt with. And using school, I think I can see a similarity there with school, using school as an example, because if there's a confrontation with two groups of students, you bring them into the office with their parents, you have a parental conference, you have the counselors there, the administrator there, monitors there for security, and at the ending of the day, there's a consequence according to the Board of Ed's policies and procedures. The child that's the perpetrator of the infraction gets the consequence. However, the restorative part is that that child also might have some counseling with the counselor. And when that child sees the administrator, let's say myself, walking in the hallway, I would call out to the student and ask how they're doing. And sometimes you could tell the student is like a little bit apprehensive. They don't know how's, Dr. Gordon going to respond to me. Is he going to remember what I did or what I said?
Mhm.
But I'm saying, hey, how are things? Is everything all right? And just to help to restore that child's self-efficacy and to build that up again. And so they know that I'm not holding anything against them, and then bringing them back into the community of other students so they can continue to learn. And that's why we have our behavioral expectations of, be safe, be respectful, be responsible in all areas of the campus. And the students see that we don't hate them. It's the deed that they did that went against the behavioral norms of the school.
Mhm.
So that had to be dealt with, as then we restore that student back into where they needed to be. Is that a good analogy or example of restorative justice for community?
Absolutely. One of the things I learned about restorative justice is how ultimately it's rooted in cultures that we wouldn't call Western anymore, and that in cultures that are much more communal. And so they had a sense of obligation and connection to one another that we don't often have in a Western world that's much more focused on the individual. And again, I think one of the things that punitive justice and distributive justice have in common is the sense that, one, we're going to deal with the individual, and we're going to deal with them one time in one way, and then we're done. Then we're hands off. And we know for sure that punishing people doesn't usually result in any transformation. And more we're realizing just giving people things doesn't result in transformation, because in our deepest selves, I think what all of us long for is connection. And that's what restorative justice takes seriously, that the goal at the end of all of this is to restore people to the community. So those guidelines that you mentioned, that's about what it means to be in a community. And when somebody offends those guidelines, there was a break in the community. And our goal when that happens is to do whatever it takes to restore that community to itself, and to restore all the individuals back to that community again, so that they can experience that connection we all want to feel deep down inside. And that doesn't exclude punishment necessarily.
Right. There's consequence.
There
is consequences, but then there's that other part there to help to restore, to build them back, as they're a part of the whole. And so if a part is missing of that whole, then there's a little deficit there. So you want to include everyone. You still deal with the behavior. You don't ignore that, but then there's room for restoring that student or that person in the community back into the whole of that community again.
I do hear people talk about restorative justice sometimes, and it becomes very soft, in that restorative justice is about having a conversation with somebody, making sure they knew what they did was wrong, and then we just kind of go back our separate ways.
Not at all.
That doesn't work, right?
No.
So it's important to say that restorative justice doesn't exclude the possibility of punishment. It's what it advocates for is that it's not a top-down decision. That if one student and another get in a fight, they're in the circle, their parents are in a circle, their friends might be included in the circle, teachers might be included in the circle. So all of them can talk together about how this incident impacted them, and all of them can decide together how we make it right moving forward, so that we can carry on as a community together.
Right.
So we can all feel restored at the end of the day.
Correct. And thank you for the clarity in showing the differences among those three, distributive versus, punitive, and then you have the restorative. And restorative, punitive, you mentioned, is more, like top down. Here, you do this, here's what you're going to get, and that's it. We throw away the key. in using the school as an analogy, so we have the Board of Ed's policies and procedures, but then teachers also come up with their own behavioral expectations in the classroom, and they have the students come up with what the behavioral norms are that they would like to see in the classroom. So that I think is a good example of how, as a class, that community right there, that microcosm of the bigger community, comes up with what the behavioral norms are. And as opposed to using the word punishment, we would say consequences, because we have both positive and then there's negative consequences. And so if A is done, you reap the reward. If B is done, well, you know what the negative consequence would be for that. But again, it's just to make sure that we have an environment that's conducive to the academic atmosphere. And to take that analogy and put it into the real world, we want to have a community, a society that's harmonious, and ensuring that everyone is safe, everyone is productive, contributing to improve this greater society. And that restorative justice component is vital, as it helps to ensure that everyone is accountable, responsible. When someone is going off track, it helps to deal with that issue that caused them to go off track, but then it also provides an opportunity for them to come back on track, be reunited with the community, then to move forward. If it's a mental issue or social emotional issue, there's steps in place that could be given to help that that individual. And that's a conversation that's happening right now. People, and this might be a trigger word if I use it for some people, when they hear the word defund the police, it sends all sorts of different thinking. However, it's about channeling the resources to those areas where individuals in the community can receive help. It doesn't mean do away with the police. And for those who might think that that's not wise, we do need protection, and that's the purpose of the police. They're there to protect and to serve the community, to make sure that there's that component of safety provided. However, if there's a mental case, then who do you want dealing with that situation? And so that's the conversation that leaders need to have within the community, how we can best help communities to improve as we move forward, keeping us safe, everyone safe, in different areas of being safe as we deal with the issues that are there. So restorative justice is part of that conversation of providing the resources that's needed to help people. Would you say that's also included in the restorative justice?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's worth pointing out to people that restorative justice, in my mind, is harder than the other versions of justice, because they require more personal investment,
commitment,
and more time from us. And more commitment as a society than the other ones might. Like we said before, if your goal is just, if you think you're going to make things right by punishing them, well, then the police take care of it, the courts take care of it, and the jails take care of it, and I don't have to worry about doing anything with it. If I'm on the other end of the spectrum, well, then I just want government to give people the health care they deserve, the education they deserve, and whatever else you want to add to the list, and I don't have to do anything about it. I don't have to be connected or engaged. And that one was a hard one for me to accept, but there's literature now that talks about, for example, toxic charity, that you can actually disempower people by not engaging them in the process of making things right. So we socialize people now sometimes totally ignorant of how the political system works, and they don't know how to advocate for themselves. They don't know how to vote or what the issues are. And people spend more time on social media and watching Netflix and can describe more to you about the plot of the newest show than they can about why they should advocate for this particular policy. All of which is to say, restorative justice requires a longer term, more significant personal investment. And we do that because we really value the community and the connection that we find there, that it does take a village to make things right for everybody. And restorative justice really embraces that idea.
Yeah, and education starts at home. When that baby makes its first cry and it's attended to, that's when education begins. And so it starts with parents, training their children to know that, we have my mom used to say this. She used to say, God is a God that is so creative that he created so many different types of individuals, but there's only one human race, and one race, so that's a human race. And so she would
Yeah.
say, he's a God of diversity, and we need to respect and appreciate each other's differences and also similarities, learn and see how we can, again, pool our resources together moving forward so we can heal and have a harmonious society, which is possible, but it starts at home. And then in the schools, we continue that in church. We continue that education. There are civic organizations that help to foster those opportunities for providing information to the greater community. And that needs to continue. And then leadership in government need to continue to tap into those resources, whether it's the home, whether it's the civic organizations, whether it's the churches, to see how we can continue to provide that education that you just so adequately described. And that is still needed, as evidenced by check Facebook, check all the memes that people click and share and keep on spreading the false information and getting into this back and forth where the rhetoric is so negative and decisive. And dismissive of each other and disrespectful. It's unfortunate, and so we need to step back. We need to breathe. We need to think first and see how can we pool our resources to heal as a people, as a nation. But we need to get the correct information first in our minds before we click share or click send or react. We need to listen to understand each other. And I'm preaching to the choir. It's just that.
Yeah.
I'm just seeing this happening
the
so
one
often.
piece so often, and I think one of the things I would add to what you said is that I think one of the sort of concepts of restorative justice is that every voice is valuable, and that one of the tools that restorative justice uses a lot is what we would call a restorative circle. But it's just, involving all of the different parties in the conversation. Again, it's engaging them in the conversation about how to make things right. But even the image of a circle says there's not one expert who's learning from everybody else, that everybody who sits at the table, whether they're a staff person or a parent or a student, for example, in a school, every voice can bring something to the circle. And unlike social media, where we're looking for something to disagree about, restorative justice would say we need to listen to one another because it's in our collective voices that we find the true wisdom of how to make things right and bring healing and wholeness for everybody involved and for the community as a whole.
Right. So would you say that's one of the basic building blocks then for restorative justice, to put that theory into reality, what it looks like for someone who might not know? That's an excellent example of what restorative justice could look like, whether it's in the home, having cousins, brothers, sisters who might be at each other's throats, coming together. How can we come to a resolution? And then at schools doing the same thing.
Yeah, I think what that last part, I think, is one of the things that, as a parent myself, I've sort of had to figure out with my wife and with our kids is, if we take this seriously, obviously we're the parents and they're the kids, but somehow we have to make space in our family decisions for the voices of our kids, that they're not, objects for our manipulation. They're human beings who get to speak into the decisions we make and how we use our resources and things like that. And so one of the components of restorative justice that I hold dear and pass on as often as I can is to help people understand how it's not our needs that are in conflict, it's our strategies that are in conflict. So I think
it's not our needs that's in conflict, it's our strategies that's in conflict.
It's our strategies that are in conflict. So we have physical needs, hunger, drinking, sleeping, those kinds of things. There are kind of social emotional needs of connection, respect, dignity, purpose, those kinds of things. The list can be pretty long. So we all have kind of inherent human needs, and then all of us develop strategies to meet those needs. I think one that lots of parents can relate to is the use of cell phones now, right? So parents and kids can butt heads, I'm sure, over the use of cell phones, the amount of use, how they're being used, all those kinds of things. And so to help parents see that using a cell phone is a strategy for meeting a need. It might be connection, might be recognition, whatever the case might be, is a strategy to meet that need.
Right.
Your desire to not have your child use the cell phone at the dinner table is also a strategy to meet a need. And it might be connection, it might be respect, it might be whatever the case might be. So if you can acknowledge that if I can acknowledge that my child's need for connection and my need for respect are not the things that are in conflict right now, it's the strategy of the cell phone, then we can have a conversation about, I can value my child's need for respect, and ideally he can value my need for respect and connection, and we can come up then with a different strategy so that all of us can still have our needs met.
Yeah,
And
like
again,
talking about timing. Yeah.
Yeah, right. This requires, though, that I acknowledge that my child has a voice and deserves a voice and a say in the conversation, which restorative justice would absolutely advocate for. But the conflict can be de-escalated a little bit if we can recognize the difference between the need that I'm feeling and the strategy that I'm using to meet that need.
Yeah, that's
and
key.
I think we don't have to talk about this one, but defund the police is a perfect example. The conflict that we're having there is ultimately not about defunding the police. That's a strategy
Right.
to meet needs. And then you can talk with people about what need are you trying to meet through this, either opposing defunding the police or supporting defunding the police. You're doing those things, making that choice out of some need. Is it safety? Is it justice? What is the need that you really don't want to lose sight of? And then let's talk about various strategies that we can use to make sure that those needs are still met. Because I don't oppose you needing safety or security or respect. There's plenty of that to go around. Taking the time, though, to develop strategies so that all of our needs can be met together is an essential one in restorative justice.
And it requires for leadership to be mature enough to have the conversations, bringing everyone, all of those key players, to sit down around the table and having the dialogue. That's so important, so that we don't get confused with labels, we don't get confused with terminologies, we don't get confused with operational definitions, because at the ending of the day, we might be saying the same thing, but calling it something else totally different. And so we do need, as a society, we need a safe society, a safer society. And there are people tasked with that responsibility. Police was just an example that was used, but they are not the only ones that are tasked with that responsibility. There's so many other professions that are included in that as well. And each one of us, as members of this bigger society, living in the nation or living wherever we are in the world, we are responsible for our behavior. And it starts with what we think, and what we think affects how we feel, and how we feel affects what we say. What we say affects, what we do, affects our character, and then that determines our destiny. And so, again, what are we allowing into our minds and as we interact with each other? So that education starts at home, and then it's reinforced in schools and church. And as we get older, we're responsible for our learning. And sometimes we might find information that causes us to have to rethink what we were taught, and examine that. And it's kind of hard for some people, because they might have been taught by people who they love so very, very dearly, and are trusted individuals in their communities. And maybe that information was not as factual, or maybe in light of new information, they have to do a little bit of rethinking. And some people are still tenaciously holding on to some belief systems that are not beneficial to everyone. And so it's okay to examine and use, for those who claim the cause of Christ, for example, use the Bible as a guide to see, well, how would, in my understanding of God, what is his response to A, B, C, X, Y, Z, as we deal together as a community to heal? What would he do?
Yeah.
Me to preach.
Right. And so that's valuable to me, especially as I consider like an education setting, for example. As I think about the notion of needs again, I think more and more what we're learning about child development and the human brain is the ways that traumatic events and chronic stress really impede the brain's ability to remember and to think clearly. And so when you're dealing with a population of students who come out of stressed environments, or students who have experienced the trauma of a hurricane, and they're just struggling in school, I think if you're coming into the classroom with a punitive approach, kids who are misbehaving might, the response might be punishment.
Right.
But if we're really focused in a restorative way on students' needs, we'll take a step back and say, okay, what do these students need, considering their where they've come from or what they've just experienced? What sorts of things do students need so that they can learn in healthier ways? Because punishment, we're learning, just kind of reinforces the trauma. So moving in that direction, I should say, like physical punishment or harsh
Abuse. Yeah.
Abuse, right? Abuse will reinforce the trauma and therefore further impede their ability to learn, not because they themselves are deficient, but because what they've experienced has put them in a state where they're just focused on surviving. And they can get out of it. And that's why schools incorporating restorative justice are using things like meditation rooms, incorporating yoga, because these kids are incredibly resilient. If given the time and the space to kind of center themselves and be present, they can learn like anybody else can learn. We're just learning new ways about what that looks like, and restorative justice, I think, has embraced it because it's really focused on meeting students' needs.
Yeah, needs versus strategies, like you said, and I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. That it's not just a term; it's actually an action. Understanding, okay, here are the needs, listing what they are, putting your finger and identifying what those needs are. Let's look at different strategies or solutions to making sure that we're moving forward and communicating that effectively. So I get that. So thank you for sharing that thought. And so what you've shared also is really good for parenting, as you mentioned, how restorative justice would work in education. And I can see that working for parenting as well at home. And we talked a lot about the community as a whole in dealing with how restorative justice will look in dealing with crime. I see how that can work. Any other thoughts you want to share about either restorative justice at home or in school or the community?
I think the criminal justice system offers some of the best evidence for why we should consider restorative justice, simply because what we're doing right now clearly isn't working. When you look at crime levels, when you look at the rates of recidivism, when you look at what people in jail experience from guards or other inmates, there just isn't a lot of restoration happening. We don't see people coming out of jail and then all of a sudden are productive members of society, because they're often have their pain reinforced or become victims of crime after they've committed it. So I think,
or they can't get a job afterwards.
Can't get a job, right?
Yeah. So that just keeps that cycle going
over and over. Restorative justice commends itself, I think, because of that, but also because when people interview victims of crimes, ultimately the question that they most want answered is, why me? Why did this happen to me? Is there something wrong with me? Is there something weak about me that led this to happen? And so when a victim and offender get to sit down and talk about it, it often turns out that the answer is you were the one who was there.
Wrong place at the wrong time.
Wrong place, wrong time. There's nothing specifically about you. And that turns out to be a significant relief to a lot of the victims of crime. And I want to insert here too, to be very clear that we as a society can't ever force victims to come into a restorative circle with their offenders. If they're not ready emotionally or physically to do that, they shouldn't be forced or blamed or shamed into that confrontation or conversation. And the same
Give
should
them a
be said of the
choice to
offender.
do so, right?
Give them a choice to do so. And some offenders are just never going to be ready to sit down and with some sense of remorse and desire to repair. Some offenders will never be ready, and they're not going to be able to come into a circle either. So I'm not saying restorative justice is a silver bullet in each and every case all the
Right.
time.
Because you're
I
not
do think
saying
it offers a lot
that you want the
more.
rapist to be with the victim who was raped. You're not saying that either.
Right. That
Yeah.
has happened, but
Yeah.
it is incredibly rare.
Right.
And requires a lot of counseling and a lot of work before that can ever happen.
A lot of sensitivity.
As far as the offender is concerned, a lot of sensitivity, yeah. As far as the offender is concerned, because of the way we do things now, as soon as an offender is caught, they get put on the defensive, right? And they're on the defensive not against the victim, but against the state. They have to defend themselves against the system, and the victim is sort of left on the side. So even in a trial, it's the state of such and such against so and so. And even if the offender wanted to repair the damage done or express remorse, the first thing that they have to worry about is defending themselves against the state. And restorative justice, again, just wants to reemphasize that we are all part of a community. And when some harm is done, obviously the greatest harm is done to the victim, but all of us experience it in some way. And we can feel that here when anytime gun violence happens in the streets.
You have two victims.
Obviously impacts the victims. Yeah, and the families,
right.
And anybody else who's out at night. I mean, all of us carry some sense of that burden, and the social fabric gets torn when those harms are done. And restorative justice just takes that seriously and says, let's all engage as a larger society. Let's all share our voices, and together, let's all figure out how to make things right again. Because ultimately, we want everybody restored and at the table and feeling like they belong and are part of the community.
Absolutely. I tend to end the podcast by saying, we have faith, we have hope, and we have love. All of those are three important ingredients that we need to have this harmonious society that we're talking about, and restorative justice is right in there as well, and reflects that faith that we have in humanity and the hope that we have, and love is that foundation. And the greatest of all those three is love. And so I can see how restorative justice can be something that we not just only talk about now. We need to continue the conversation as a community, and it starts like what we're doing, but then also doing something and acting on it, and moving away from the visceral attacks against each other on Facebook, the visceral attacks face-to-face or on the phone, and let's be still within ourselves, and let's find ways in which we can heal as a people moving forward. And when I say as a people, I mean collectively, from all walks of life, regardless of zip codes, time zones, identity. Let us look for the decency within ourselves and in each other to move forward, to heal, using our unique gifts, talents, professions, and opportunities that we have to do so. So thank you so much, Pastor Peter, for sharing your thoughts. I want us to continue talking even so much more, but would you be willing to come back and perhaps either continue the conversation about restorative justice or some other topic that's of interest and that's relevant to where we live today?
I have enough of an ego to say that I would always be willing to come and talk about all the things that I know. But no, so thank you, Dr. Gordon. I would love to come back anytime if I can contribute knowledge or action to making this community better for everybody. I'm happy to do that. So thank you for having me on, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation anytime.
Thank you so much. I would be glad to have you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for joining Positive Solutions with Dr. Gordon as we learned about different perspectives of contemporary social and educational issues. We hope to educate and encourage as we analyze those topics that are important to you. Please continue to join us every Sunday afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, as new episodes are uploaded on your favorite podcast directory. Don't forget to subscribe by clicking on the link below this episode and respond to our fun trivia questions at drgordonpodcast1@gmail.com. Remember, become that positive difference that creates a positive outcome in the lives of others as well as in your own life. See you next Sunday afternoon on Positive Solutions with Dr. Gordon.